This video is going to talk about the difference between a perfectly competitive industry that happens to be a constant cost industry versus an increasing cost industry. Now, this is a concept that often confuses people because we've already talked about back in chapter 7. We introduced the idea of constant versus increasing and then also decreasing returns to scale. Now, returns to scale refer to what happens for one firm as they change the amount of inputs that they produce, that they use. So if a firm was to double all of their inputs and then their output exactly doubles, well, we would call that constant returns to scale. And with constant returns to scale, you'd have a horizontal average cost curve. And we also talk about increasing returns to scale and then decreasing returns to scale. This is something different. This is a constant versus an increasing cost industry. And this is perfect competition. And what this refers to is what happens in this industry as the number of firms in the industry changes. Firms in perfect competition are small, so they're price takers. They're price takers in the industry that they're operating in, but they'd also be price takers in input markets. So a perfectly competitive firm is hiring labor, they're hiring capital, other inputs. And what we'll assume is that each of those firms are so small, they won't have any impact on the wage of labor that they have to hire. So if you have a lawn mowing business, you're going to hire some more workers to work for you. That's not going to change the wages of that you'd have to pay for this type of labor in the economy. If a lawnmower company needs to buy an extra lawnmower, that's not going to have any effect on the price of lawnmowers. So each individual firm would be a price taker in those input markets. But even though each firm might be a price taker in input markets, something different could happen if we all of a sudden have a whole bunch more firms in this industry. Any one firm thinks that they could hire as many units of labor as they need or buy as many, say, mowers as they might need to expand their business. But if you've got like 1,000 firms in this industry, and then we go from 1,000 firms to like 1,500 or 2,000 firms, well, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch more firms that are trying to hire these same inputs. So if you want to think about it in the input markets, there could be an increase in demand. And depending on the nature of these inputs, some of these inputs might not be perfectly elastically supplied. So in other words, as you have an increase in the number of firms that are in this industry, they could be bidding up the prices of some of the inputs that they're using. And that's what we're catching here with this idea of an increasing cost industry. So one example of this might be where it be particularly relevant, but probably not lawn mowing, because lawn mowing is probably going to be a constant cost industry. But suppose you look at like the movie industry, movie and television. And so now you have specialized inputs like actors and actresses and directors. And now for any one production company, if like say one independent production company wanted to make a few extra movies, they might have to hire one more director or some more actors. In those markets, they're likely to be relatively small, so you might think about like, oh, if you have to hire one more actor to be in a movie or to be in a TV series, that's not going to have any effect on the overall salaries of actors or salaries of directors. But all of a sudden, if you double the number of production companies out there, you might see that actors and actresses' salaries would be getting bid up because there's actually relatively few sort of good actors or actresses. And so that could be the kind of condition in which there are lots more firms in this industry, they could be seeing the wages or prices of capital, the factors of what they have to pay their factors of production go up in price. So what would be happening is that if in the long run you try to have a long run adjustment in this industry, you have an increase in the number of firms, what could be happening is that the cost curves for each typical firm in this industry could be shifting. So if an increase in the number of firms, and we could have something like this happen to the cost curves of the individual firm. We can see each of these cost curves get both the average cost curve and the marginal cost curve get bid up. They shifted up, and that we could see something like this happen. What that would mean is, well, we know that long run equilibrium price always has to be at the bottom of this U-shaped average cost curve. So as what we've seen is that if there's an increase in the number of firms, the bottom of the U will go up because these cost curves are rising. So the bottom point on this U goes up. So with more firms in this industry, the zero profit price, the price at which the firms in this industry will make a zero profit, will have risen. And so we will have had an increase in cost industry. So what we come over here is that, let's say we take these prices. We'd have a price of P1 prevail in this industry initially, but then we have a lot more firms enter the industry. We'll have a price that the price is going to be P2. So we'd come over here and say, take those same prices, because we can move them from one diagram to the next here in perfect competition. When we have a lot more firms in this industry, we'll be producing a larger quantity. So we know at a price of, initially when we have some number of firms in here, we'd be at a price like this. And then at the larger number of firms that are going to be enough to produce Q2, the price would have to be higher because input prices get bid up. And so therefore the price that firms would have to be charging to make a zero profit gets bid up, rises. And so we would end up over here at having a positively sloped long run supply curve for this competitive industry. By contrast, in a constant cost industry, you would have a horizontal long run supply curve. That in the constant cost industry, you could have a whole bunch of firms enter this market, and we wouldn't actually see the input prices get bid up. Why might that occur? Well, if you think about it, if this industry, if the firms in this industry are using very general kinds of inputs, like say a very unskilled labor, very general type of labor, and then like very simple kinds of tools. Well, you know, if you want to think about the number, any one industry is going to be small. Their total use of these very general inputs, any one industry's use of these very general inputs is likely to be quite small. Any one industry is going to use a small fraction of the unskilled labor that's being used in the economy. So even if they want to use double the amount of unskilled labor, well, they are like going to be like a price taker in that market for unskilled labor. So the difference between this would be you'd have a constant cost industry with a horizontal long run supply curve. Basically, in those cases where these firms are going to be using very general types of inputs, they don't use any kinds of really specialized inputs. You'd have an increasing cost industry with this positively sloped long run supply curve if the firms in this industry are using some specialized factors of production, and they'd be using, if you think of this industry, they're using a good share of that specialized factor of production. So if any one firm could use a little bit more without bidding up the prices, but if you have, like, say, a doubling of the number of firms in this industry, you're trying to produce a lot more of this good, you'll see those input prices get bid up. So that's the difference between constant versus increasing cost industries. And remember, this is different from what we talked about previously back in Chapter 7 when we talked about constant versus increasing returns to scale. So two different concepts completely. You want to try to keep those separate. Usually it's far more easier when you're drawing these, looking at shifts in the equilibrium of perfect competition, to simply assume the constant cost case. In fact, probably in principles of economics, we wouldn't even like talk about this. If we wanted to go through the equilibrium of perfect competition, we wouldn't even mention the possibility of an increasing cost. So we would have this here. I guess just to complete this out, you could also, in theory, have a decreasing cost industry. That would be like one possibility. That's probably not all that likely, so we don't actually cover that in the book. We're not going to consider any cases of that. But you could, in theory, perhaps have a decreasing cost industry. So there you have it: constant versus increasing cost industry in perfect competition.